Plane's not flying yet, second engine.
Does it use the from the guy with the
special clamps on the exhaust?
Very acknowledged with us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Good evening, gentlemen. A number of years ago, and I don't remember exactly how many, the Western Reserve Historical Society asked me if I could do a program on that big building at the airport. And at that point in time, the IX Files television program was very popular, so they decided to call the program the IX Files, AKA also known as the Bomber Plan. So I thought we'd start off with a little bomber history. The first bomber built for the United States Army Air Corps was a Martin, and it was built on St. Clair Avenue in Cleveland. Martin moved to Baltimore and shortly thereafter developed the B10 Bomber. This was a radical innovation in that it had a retractable landing gear, it was pretty much all metal, and the personnel were inside the aircraft, not hanging outside or being beat up by the wind. 1934, the U.S. Army Air Corps started looking for a long-range heavy bomber with a range of 5,000 miles, top speed of 200 miles an hour, and 2,000 pounds of bombs. Contracts went to Boeing and to Martin. The Boeing design was accepted as the XB-15. This is a photograph of the B-15 taken at the Cleveland National Air Races in 1938. It took until between 37 and 38 to actually get the airplane in the air from concept. And the biggest reason is they couldn't develop the engines big enough, powerful enough to lift this thing in the air. The Martin design was not accepted, and that contract was canceled. They never even came up with a prototype. It's pretty rational. Now, in order to fulfill those specifications, they needed a pretty husky engine. And General Motors Allison division had this 3420, which would develop 2,600 horsepower.
Wow.
Unfortunately, it wasn't ready for the airplane. And this has been a history in bombers that the airframes usually are way ahead of the power plant. So they had a substitute, the 2,600 horsepower. They put a Pratt Whitney in there with 1,200 horsepower. So it couldn't achieve all the design specifications, but the Army did accept it. And this is a picture of, they called it the Sky Battleship. That was a very large wing. It was large enough to allow an engineer to crawl through the wing and do minor adjustments on the engines while in flight. It was really innovative design by Boeing. It was the first bomber with dual wheels, the first bomber with de-icers, first bomber with autopilot, the first bomber with crew rest, the first bomber with the lavatory, and some kind of a galley. So they were really thinking. Boeing was, I think, a little ahead of the Army Air Corps. I don't know who did it, but somebody put a Kilroy picture painted on it, probably photoshopped in this, but it's the best picture I could find. So it was a very innovative design, and it worked out very well. Unfortunately, it was the only one ever built. Now, in order to test the wing, they ran out of sandbags, so the Air Force improvised and came up with this idea. And they were satisfied that the wings would stay on in flight. Now, that wing platform and those engines were used by Boeing to develop the Model 314 Clipper ships, which were very successful. These were very luxurious aircraft and very popular at that point in time, and went into service during the war. They also needed another bomber to replace the B-10, so they sent out specifications again, and Boeing came up with this model B-17, which some reporter, when saw it, said, that is a flying fortress, and the name stuck, and they used it. Notice the turret, that bathtub underneath the trailing edge of the wing there. Now the other one came from Douglas, and that was really a modified DC-2, DC-3. And guess which one won? The Douglas one. Yeah, the reason? When the B-17 took off for the test, it crashed because the gust locks were not taken off. Killed the pilot. But the Army Air Corps still, they had to give the contract to Douglas, but they did order, I think, 13 or 15 just to get things started, because this is the airplane that the Army Air Corps wanted. So instead of going on forward with the B-15 and developing that, Congress got involved again, and they wanted to give a contract to Douglas, and Douglas came up with the B-19, which is a very, very large airplane, I think 210-foot wingspan. And they put R-3350s on that one, but this gives you a comparison with a DC-3 in the background there, the size of that monster. They had single wheel tires on that one, and I believe they still have one down at Maps, right, Adam? Last time we were down there, I think. Okay, but to give you an idea of the size, they have a young lady there. World War II happened on December 7th, and we were now at war. The B-17s, we only had a handful of B-17s when the war started. We were producing these aircraft, but they were being sold to England and Netherlands and Australia and other countries, and our Air Corps wasn't really buying that many of them. So they went into production, and they offered a license to Consolidated to build them, you know, under license, and Consolidated said, no, we'd rather build our own, and they developed the B-24, Consolidated B-24. This had some advantage over the 17, that it could carry more bombs, higher, and faster, but it couldn't begin to withstand the punishment that the B-17 took. Now, what Hap Arnold needed was an aircraft that could bomb Japan. And Boeing came with up with this brilliant, sleek, sophisticated super bomber, but it had 4 cranky engines. And it almost canceled the program unless they could get those engines to work. In 1940, NACA elected to build a new facility here at the Cleveland Airport, and the first building they put up was the hangar, which amounted to a bunch of offices for a while until they got the other buildings built. But what they needed was a high altitude wind tunnel, because this engine, this 3350, this Cyclone twin row, was going to power that B-29. And because Wright was already working on the next prototype, they asked NACA to solve the problems on this engine. And what you see there is a technician from Wright advising the people at NACA of how the engine was configured. And there were 3 things they did, three crews, 3 sections that worked on it. One of the problems was that the valve heads were breaking off. Well, they came up with a solution to that by reconfiguring the cylinder head. And the other was cooling problems, and you see, being a twin row, baffling was pretty important, so they rearranged the baffles. And the third thing they did was the cowl flaps on the engine were designed to be open or closed. And they came up with a variable motor to control that, because they found out in these long flights of 8, 10, 12 hours to Japan that if the cowl flaps were too far closed, the engine would overheat and you'd be in big trouble. And if you open them up too far, it'd slow the aircraft down and you'd fall out of formation. So you can imagine tweaking those cowl flaps for hours at a time. But NACA did save the day. And this is the high altitude wind tunnel. Now, in order to test those engines at altitude here on the ground, they had to cool that wind tunnel, and that's a monster. And this is the air conditioner it took to cool that wind tunnel, designed by a gentleman by the name of Courier. And in 1942, I believe it was February or early, no, it was end of February, early March, they started building this plant. And it was the initial building itself. Yeah, okay, the building itself was done, finished, not inside, but the shell of the building and the roof was done Thanksgiving Day. That's how fast they operated, because it was 24/7. And one of our guys in the Society of Air Racing Historians said, you know, Bill, I helped build that building. And I said, come on, you're pulling my leg, you couldn't do that. And he says, oh yeah. He says, I took care of the horses. I said, what? What's that got to do with it? He said, well, under construction and even after it was built, either the Army or the sheriff's, I think it was the sheriff's department here in Cleveland, they rode around that building on horses all night to protect it because they were afraid of espionage here. And then they built the engineering building over here, 3 stories. And you know, they didn't have computers then. And all of those things that were designed had to be drawn. And that's a better picture of the engineered building. Now that building has a full basement. You know, I've heard all kinds of stories, a half basement, a quarter basement, no basement. Yes, about 8 or 9 months ago, I had the privilege of being on a golf cart, and we rode through the whole basement of that building. And there's some design, modern designs being used by engineers. There's a lot of this concrete. If you've been in that building, if you've taken the stairs down to the baths or the restrooms, they wouldn't let you go any further, but it's cleaned up now. They had a huge cafeteria in there. I think it took 17 furnaces to heat it. And they had a hospital, they had a shoe store, and an eyeglass store, yeah, right in that building. They needed hangars because as the bombers came out of the building, they had to be tweaked. And here again, we were short of steel. So the Corps of Engineers came up with these wooden trusses, and at that time, they were the largest trusses ever made. And they were 200 feet wide. This is an aerial view taken much later of the plant and the 2 hangars. Now, in order to build the B-17, these are the component parts. Obviously, the main section is the center section and the spar, and these other components were added to it. Now, General Motors came up, shortly after they got the contract, General Motors came up with the idea that, you know what, Uncle Sam, we'd like to build a fighter. We're going to need a fighter, so we've got this great idea. We've got this engine, and there are existing wings, and the wings of a P-40, the tail of a Dauntless, and landing gear of the Corsair, and we'll build a fuselage and the engine, and this will be a dynamite fighter or interceptor. And the government bought the idea, and decided they'd split the factory and only build the component parts for the bomber. And here you see women working with the men. Vertical stabilizer here. And this is the dorsal fin being put together, mostly by women. And they had contests going here to see who could build the most in the shortest period of time. And this will give you an idea of the vertical fin on end. And remember this here. Now this is when women really got going, and Rosie the Riveter became a national symbol. And actually, well, Norman Rockwell had to have his idea too, so he came up with this idea, Rosie the Riveter. But actually, the first one was this young lady out of high school being trained to run and operate a machine in New Jersey, I think, and her name was Gwendolyn Doyle. That was the original Rosie the Riveter. Now here in Cleveland, they did what they could to maintain morale, because these people were working 7 days a week, finally cut it back to 6 days. And they did whatever they could to entertain the gals working there, and took them out for fishing trips and just riding around in the lake. I did a talk at a local library, and a lady came up to me and said she had worked there years ago, and she said, "Did you know we had patches?" I said, "No." She said, "You know, you guys in the Army had patches on your shoulder?" She said, "We had patches for our work uniforms," and she gave me this one. Let's give you an idea of the size of some of the components. That's the horizontal stabilizer being assembled. And when they're done, this is what they look like, with a gentleman there to give you a reference on how big. There's all kinds of numbers, and I don't have them or remember them, but if you notice those fluorescent lights, I have a friend that was, quote unquote, an electrician, and he said there was crews that did nothing but change those fluorescent tubes. It was a never-ending process. By the time they got the one building done, they were doing it all over again. These are outer wing panels being put together. And these are the jigs for the flaps. Pretty big. Notice the floor, it's all wood. I don't know, I had a number of approximately how many million pieces of wood were in that floor, because we have two floors, the top floor and the basement floor. Here the wing flaps are being rolled into specially built railroad cars. So in order to build just component parts, they had to be shipped to factories that were completing the assembly. And I think these went to Omaha. These are the most complicated part of building the aircraft, is the engine nacelles. They were built out on Coit Road on East 185th and finally transferred to the bomber plant. Here you see 4 of these going into a railroad car. Now the aircraft that General Motors proposed was the XP-75, and they actually got Donovan Berlin from Curtiss, who had developed and designed the P-40 aircraft, and he was the one that came up with this idea. I don't think I've ever seen an uglier aircraft in all my life, but you can, it was mid-engine, the 3420 was here, and this is the scoop. The biggest problem they had was cooling the engine, and that was the defeat of the aircraft. Contra-rotating props. Here we see the 3420 again. It was 2 Allison V12s on a common crank case with 2 crankshafts. And they had shafts going underneath the pilot's seat to a gearbox, and then for contra-rotating props. This is the assembly line, and there weren't very many of them built. Now, the aircraft you see in the top end here is the B-19. They brought it here to install those 3420 engines on it. And on that aircraft, it was successful. And that aircraft soldiered on all through World War II as a hack or transport or wherever they needed it. They also put the 3420s into a B-29, and the reason for doing this was that should the right engine fail, they needed a backup because they desperately needed this aircraft, and it did prove successful. Now, any number of people had seen this aircraft coming out of the plant and said, oh, they built airplanes here. And no, they modified airplanes, but they didn't build the bombers here. So the bombers were built in Seattle, in Wichita, Omaha, and in Atlanta, Georgia. Now, at the war's end, the B-19 ended up out at Kingman, and it was scheduled to be saved for the Museum of the United States Air Force. And some colonel took over and said, we don't need that piece of junk, scrap it. It took about 3 days just to cut it up. But you notice the red vertical stabilizer and the red nose? That airplane was used in thunderstorm tests. They would fly this thing into thunderstorms and see how much damage it could take, or try to get readings of the atmosphere at that point in time. Now, the XP-75 had something really going for it, and this is taken in a hangar, and it had some real weapons on it. It had 350 calibers in that wing, had 350 calibers in that wing, and it had 450 calibers in the nose, for a total of 10 50 calibers. I've seen what Quad 50 can do, but I've never seen what 10 times the 50 caliber would do. But it would have been a great ground support airplane had it been successful. We had a number of crashes. This one crashed on Rain Avenue, right over past Rocky River, the Rocky River Reservation, and it came apart and landed a couple yards away. This is the tail section. He was fortunate enough to bail out and survive. The second one crashed in Brook Park. He wasn't that fortunate. He tried to get out, but it was too late. So we lost 2 pilots, and I understand there was at least 3 or perhaps even 4 of them crashed. Finally, this is what it looked like when NACA redesigned the fuselage and had to put a bigger vertical stabilizer on it. But it looks like it could have been at least a good ground support airplane, because the visibility would have been excellent. And with that firepower and the power of the engine, it should have been a good airplane. But by then, the P-47 had been developed. The P-51 was doing well with the Merlin engine, and there was no need for another one. Now, the program that Hap Arnold was after to start bombing Japan, he needed 75 aircraft to start a training program. I believe this was taken in Wichita, and when the 75th one was coming down the assembly line, they invited him to come over, and he autographed the airplane. Well, that went on to fly many missions to Tokyo and back, and one of the biggest problems they had in bombing Tokyo was the weather was so unpredictable. Changing winds, bombing wasn't that accurate. So they usually sent a pathfinder ahead, and this particular aircraft was the pathfinder, but it also carried bombs. And it couldn't find its initial target, and it went to its secondary target. And by now, They knew the weather was bad back at the base, and they had the squadrons turn around and return to base. But this particular aircraft had a radio problem. They never got the message. So when looking around trying to find something, they literally realized that they didn't have enough fuel to get back to base. So they elected to go to Russia and intern themselves. And when they landed in Russia, they were immediately removed from the aircraft and put in the back of a truck and hauled away. And when Joe Stalin heard about this, he had been asking our government for some of these aircraft on Lend-Lease, and we kept denying him. So he was pretty happy when he had one. So he brought in, I can't think of the man's name now, Topolov, I think it was, brought him in and he said, look, I want you to duplicate this airplane exactly. You have 1 year to do it or you're dead. And he meant it. So they did it. He got it done. And this is the Tupolev Tu-4. Now, interestingly enough, not too long ago I was watching a history program, and it happened to be a crew member that told the story, crew member that was on this aircraft that went to Russia. And he said they really copied it exactly. He said about 2 weeks before we left on this mission, somebody stuck a ladder in a rudder and damaged the fabric. So a patch was put on. And he said, would you believe a Russian airplane had a patch in that same place? So now the war's over and there's no need to build bombers or fighters here, so they got to pack up all their equipment, which they did in a very uniform way. And got rid of most of it. And in 1946, we had the first National Aircraft Show here. And it's kind of hard to see, but there's a B-29 back there. And this show was to help sell all these pilots that are returning from World War II. Because they're all going to buy an airplane, right? Nah, didn't happen. So that was one of the first civilian uses they used at the building. Now in 46, 7, 8, and 9, they used the bomber plant facility for the national air races. Now these are the grandstands up here. They would park in a building, come through the plant, and access the grandstands here. And Home Island was right about here. So that was another use for the building. But it wound up with 5 lives. So it became the War Assets Administration. World War II surplus equipment and supplies. American factories had produced massive amounts of weaponry for World War II, and hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies, military equipment. Some of it had to be sold here to the highest bidder for resale. There's a lot of surplus shops after the war. You may remember that. I remember seeing quite a few of them. You know, you could buy drop tanks and all kinds of things. And then they decided to use it to dispose of these things. So it became the 863rd Army Air Force Depot. By now it's the Air Force. It was the National Center for Sale of Surplus Aircraft. It was also used for surplus storage. The entire floor here is covered with soybeans. They even let the Boy Scouts use it once. We also had the 922 Air Force Recovery Squadron here. I don't know if you're familiar with the Recovery Squadron, but I think that P-80 sitting there was probably the only aircraft they had. Recovery Squadron was because of the Cold War, when our planes they had to go to Russia. Russia would have probably retaliated and bombed our bases, so our bases would have been destroyed. So they had to have a place to land, and Cleveland was it. It was the recovery area for Cold War bombers. And then in 1950, the Korean War started. And once we got started, we realized that we hadn't upgraded a lot of our equipment. And one of them was the tanks. And they turned the plant into a tank plant, General Motors Cadillac plant. And the M24 Reconnaissance Tank was the one chosen to be modified, rebuilt here. And these were in pretty bad shape because they'd gone through many, many campaigns. And I can tell you personally, they weren't in very good shape because this was my M24. I was tank commander on a 24 in Recon company. And this was the upgrade. We had 2 Cadillac V8 engines with 2 hydromatic transmissions, transfer case in the M24, and the T-41 Walker Bulldog had a 500 horsepower Continental aircraft engine in it, Allison cross-axle drive, and the gun went from 75 millimeter to souped up 76, and they were really fast. Came back from Korea and went out to see what was going on out there because we never got one of them because they weren't being sold to the government because the government weren't accepting them. They were flawed. So I was curious and I went out there and they hired me. I was offered a job as an assistant foreman, and this is what it looked like when I landed at Cleveland Municipal Airport. There's almost 500 vehicles there. They had been cocooned, and the job we had then was to strip the cocooning off and bring them in and do the modifications and then ship them out. So Korea never saw these things until sometime after the armistice was signed. Then we had the Vietnam War, and we built tanks for the Vietnam War. And I can remember lived near the airport, and the C-1, I think the C-141 Starlifters would come in, and they were always experimenting with a new version, and they would put one of these on the Starlifter and fly it over to Vietnam. Allison built those. Now there was no use for it, so it was for sale. And at that point in time, they were trying to entice Volkswagen company to use it to build Volkswagens here in the United States. That didn't happen. They decided to go to Pennsylvania and the plant there, so it was for sale. So Cleveland bid $1 million, and Brook Park bid $2 million, and Cleveland bid $3 million, and Brook Park bid $4 million, and Mr. Park came along and said $7 million, and they said sold. So a lot had to be done. That building had to be demolished, and all that wooden floor had to be torn off. So while that was going on, I was asked to do a lecture for engineers there at NASA, and the fellow that invited me said, "I got to tell you a little story before you start." And I said, "Well, what's that?" He said, "Well, we were doing a program here. I can't tell you what the program was, but we had brought all these military airplanes in here." And he said, "You know, we only had this one hangar." So my boss says, "What are we going to do with all these airplanes?" And he said, "Well, you know what? I know a fellow over in the building, the bomber plant building. He said, let me go talk to them. You know, they got these huge doors." And so I went over and I spoke to him, and he says, "Oh, sure." He says, "You guys are welcome to use that." He said, "Let me show you the place." So I said, "Okay." He said, "You got to wait here till I put the guard dog away." So it was about 10 minutes before he came back. And I said, "You know, I don't know what you got there, but that guard dog kind of sounds like a lion. Well, it was Mr. Park's pet, Tanya, pretty tame. They brought her in a jet, tranquilized, of course. And this is an up-close picture of her. And this is what you see the building today. Now initially, does anybody remember here that it was painted blue? It was painted blue, and they had a guarantee from the paint company that the paint wouldn't come off, blister. Guess what? It did. So they sued, and the paint company had to side the building. 3 sides are aluminum on one side, and that would be what on the north side is fiberglass because of the radar. Currently, those 2 hangars are an FBO, Atlantic Aviation. Now, did any of the P-75 survive, or any of the B-29s? Yep, it took a while for me to find the 75, and that was at the National Museum of the United States Air Force. And it had just lingered there for years because there was a controversy between them and the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian actually owned the aircraft over how to restore it. And they finally resolved the issues and went back sometime later after it was cleaned up and polished. And that's what it looks like today. Now, yes, there was one B-29, and you know it as Fifi. At that time was the Confederate Air Force. Now the Commemorative Air Force has been flying that around the country and perhaps other parts of the world. And it actually showed up here in Cleveland more than once. And here's Fifi inside the IX building in 1989. Now, Tony Mazzolini, a good friend of mine, was with the Confederate Air Force, and he broke away. You know, sometimes politics get involved. And he wanted a B-29, and it took him 14 years to negotiate with the Navy because there was one left out at Naval Air Station China Lake, and he found out about it. And this is what it looked like. They finally settled on a deal where it was a trade. You couldn't buy anything from the Navy. And the Navy wanted a B-25 B model to represent Jimmy Doolittle's Raider on a carrier Wasp. And so I happen to be a charter member at USAM, and we were able to secure a B-25 out of Caracas and brought it up here and rebuilt it for static display. And we were getting close to getting it done, and we had been using a big building, a Cleveland Crane Company building, and for next to nothing for rent. And after we fixed the building up, the owner decided he could rent it out. So we got tossed out, and it went to Beaver Falls, and it was actually finished there. So the Navy called and asked if the B-25 was ready, and they said pretty soon. And the next question was, did you paint it? And they said, yes, sir, it's painted. Well, what color did you paint it? Well, it's painted olive drab. Why? Well, we can't have an Army airplane in the Navy Museum painted in Marine colors. So it was painted gray, and it's sitting in the parking lot down there now instead of inside the museum. This is what the airplane looked like inside. Not a whole lot to work with. But it was recovered, and it was taken in Yoakum, California, and it was decided you couldn't get too many volunteers. It was too hot there. So Tony found an angel and paid for taking it apart and transporting it to Wichita. And Boeing decided to help. And they asked for volunteers from the people that actually built the airplanes. And they got plenty of volunteers. And over a couple of years, working with the volunteers, they made it work. And this was the initial the name of the aircraft when it was used in the service. It was part of a training program. There was 8 of them, Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs. That would make 8 or 9. And we found the gentleman that had originally painted the artwork on it, and got him to do it. And we got about this far with it and just couldn't raise any more funds. And fortunately, we found people out there that were allowed to sit inside. And about a year ago, it was turned over to a new group, and they got the engines. We had the original 4 engines, original type, but Fifi now had upgraded engines, and we were able to buy the upgrades. And last fall they rolled it out, and it's now flying. It's had several flights now. This was taken in a high-speed flight. I don't know how many hours they have to work off for the FAA. And hopefully we'll get it here next year. It'll be on display. Now, if we go back 73 years to 1943, when the original contract to build completed B-29 bombers was changed, there are many people that believe had the building produced bombers, the Enola Gay and Boxcar, would have probably been built at the bomber plant in Cleveland, Ohio. And very possibly Boeing would be producing Dreamliners today here at the airport. Thank you.
None of the tanks that they built there during the Korean War ever saw service overseas?
They didn't see service in Korea, because I left 3 weeks before it ended. Didn't see any. They were still trying to ship them out here. They were just starting to ship them out.
Okay.
But no, we never got one of them.
What they do with them?
They sold them. Finland, I think, and some other countries for them.
Okay.
Anyone else? Yes?
Where'd they get the materials to build that? The building, did they get the materials locally? Were they sourced locally?
The constructed bomber plant building? Pretty much locally, yeah. We had the steel mills here, but steel was in such great demand that they got to improvise a lot of ways, and they were able to save them. Somewhere have the amount of tons of steel they saved by the wooden truss and the reinforced concrete in the floors. Sir? You have a question?
So they only built B-29 components here? And that's
Correct. The outer
started-
wing panels, the flaps, the complete empennage, and then the cells. That's all it was built. Then they had to be shipped to, I believe, most of them went to Omaha, some of them went to Atlanta.
They started in 1943, that was when they started producing the components?
The plant started in February of 42, and it was probably almost the end of 42, the very early 43 that they started components. I don't remember which one. Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with the Goodyear building components, World War II?
Yeah, components were sourced out to many companies. Nash Kelvinator was building, I don't know how many things, Singer was building M1s. So, yeah, they just issued licenses. And this all goes back to the Wright brothers. Now, in one of the lectures I do, I have to tell you that you probably realize that in World War I, what did we fight with in the air? British airplanes and French airplanes. We weren't producing them. Why? Because the patents that the Wright brothers had were so restrictive, and they wanted so much money, couldn't find companies to build airplanes. Now, Curtiss was their biggest enemy, and he built the Jennies in large numbers. But we had to use French airplanes or British airplanes because we didn't have them. And the government finally stepped in and said, okay, guys, all of you sit down. You take your patents and put them in a bowl, okay, and everybody gets to use them for 5%. I believe the Wright brothers were asking 20. Any other question? Well, thanks for inviting us.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Hey, Bill, not related to this, but do you guys have a layout of what the Cleveland Airport looked like in 1942 and 43? You always see the IX Center and the two hangars and what is now the FBO building. But do you have is there out of
I do a talk about the history of the Cleveland Airport, and I have all kinds of, some pictures, yes. It's called the Hangar Line.
Okay.
Down Rocky River Drive, there was 9 or 10 hangars. Some of them had administration buildings and waiting rooms.
The runway layouts.
Okay, well, back then, we had a landing mat. We had the world's largest paved surface.